Hello and welcome to this episode of Gatecrashers. Today we're looking at Gate 23, the Gate of Assimilation, individual insight and the elimination of intolerance. In this Gatecrashers episode we explore the energy through the character Miranda. This series brings human design gates to life through story, through pattern and lived experience. Gate 23 explores the individual insight that arrives without explanation, the courage to hold a knowing that can't be proven, and the art of waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hear it. We're looking at Gate 23 as a sun transit, which means that Gate 43 at the other end of the channel, which is also the polarity, it's the opposition in the wheel, it's also going to be activated through the Earth transit. The genius freak is alive in all of us during the next few days. If you're studying human design or exploring your own chart, this series may help you recognize these energies in real life. Miranda. Miranda said, "I know," the way other people say, "hello." Not as an agreement, or at least not only as an agreement, not as a conversational reflex or a filler or a social courtesy, but as a statement of fact, as information. Something had arrived, fully formed and entirely certain, and Miranda was reporting it. The phrase came out the same way whether she was confirming she knew where the car keys were or announcing mid-dinner that the entire approach to her current project needed rethinking from the ground up. Her colleagues had learned to listen for the tone. There was the "I know" that meant yes, understood, proceed. And there was the other "I know," slightly stiller, carrying a quality of weight that was hard to describe, but unmistakable once you'd heard it. That one meant something had arrived. That one meant the room was about to change. No, or wasn't, depending on timing. Miranda had not always understood the difference between those two outcomes, although these days she was beginning to. The knowing itself was not the problem. The knowing was extraordinary. She recognized this without any vanity, the way you recognize that your eyes are a particular color. The knowing arrived from somewhere she couldn't locate, in a pulse rather than a process, complete before she'd even had the chance to examine it. Not logical, not evidence-based, not built from anything she could lay out for inspection. It was simply there, whole and certain, and occasionally inconvenient, like a bird that had flown in through an open window and was now sitting, and I did say sitting, on the furniture, entirely sure it belonged there. The problem, and Miranda was now, after considerable evidence, conceding that it was occasionally a problem, was the gap between the arrival and the moment. The knowing came when it came. The moment, the precise, particular, not a second too soon moment when the room was ready to receive it, well, that was a different matter entirely. She had said the thing in meetings that weren't ready to hear the thing, had watched it land with the quality of something that had arrived out of sequence. Not wrong, not unwelcome exactly, just early, like a guest who had misread the invitation and turned up while the host was still getting dressed. She'd said the thing at dinner parties, at tables that went quiet, in the particular way of people who were digesting something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know what they were going to do with it yet. And then there were the other times, the fart in the lift times, the insight so unexpected, so off the wall, so arriving from a place nobody else in the room had been anywhere near, that the silence that followed wasn't digesting. It was simply the group decision to pretend that nothing had happened, to examine the ceiling with sudden interest, to shuffle papers, to let the thing pass and move on, never speak of it again. Miranda would still be standing there, the knowing hanging in the air between her and a room full of people who had agreed that if nobody acknowledged it, it had never happened or would just eventually go away. And sometimes it did. The insight, unheeded, would drift off. The room would carry on in the wrong direction, and occasionally Miranda would watch the consequences of that unfold months later, with the quiet resignation of someone who had tried. She had been called at various points in her life intense, strange, a lot, unsettling, and once by a manager she'd not especially respected it and who actually had meant it as an insult, not a team player. Miranda had never disputed this. It was, she reflected, the most accurate thing he'd ever said about her. Individuality is not, as a general rule, a team sport. She had been designed to know things that the team didn't know yet. The team would catch up, or it wouldn't. But either way, she was not going to pretend that her knowing wasn't there. She was not trying to destabilize anyone. She simply knew things, and the knowing wanted out. And the gap between those two facts had caused, over the years, a certain amount of turbulence in her life. Now, it should be said that not every Miranda moves through this in the same way. There's another kind, quieter on the surface and in some ways harder to spot. This Miranda also has the knowing, also carries that individual insight arriving whole and unbidden from somewhere below thought. But this Miranda has been told too many times, and from too early in her life, that what she knows is strange, unwelcome, too much. The insight arrived and was met repeatedly with the sealing, examining silence. And something in this Miranda concluded eventually that the knowing itself was the problem. So this Miranda had gone quiet. Not because the knowing stopped. The knowing never stops. It's the mechanic. But because she has stopped trusting it enough to speak it. The insight arrives, she turns it over, finds it impossible to explain, not in any terms that are going to satisfy a skeptical room at any rate, and so she puts it down, decides she must be mistaken, and waits for evidence that doesn't come, because the individual knowing doesn't work in evidence. It works in pulses. This Miranda knows things she never says, and carries underneath the quiet the particular melancholy of an insight with nowhere to go. The genius half of the genius freak equation sitting in a drawer. Same gate, same individual knowing, arriving unbidden and complete. One Miranda says it too soon and watches the room examine their fingernails. The other never says it at all, and both are waiting in their different ways for the moment that makes it possible. The shift came for our Miranda, not in a meeting or at the dinner table, but in a corridor on a Tuesday, sometime between this and that. She'd been carrying a knowing for weeks, a knowing about a colleague, about what was actually happening in a situation everyone else was reading incorrectly. She'd nearly said it 4 times, had felt the words arrive and felt the room not be ready, had on 3 of those 4 occasions managed to hold it in. On the 4th, she had half said it, trailing off when she saw the faces and watched the ceiling get a thorough inspection. And then, this Tuesday, in the corridor, the colleague herself stopped Miranda. She looked close up, like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was tired of doing it alone. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You started to say something in the meeting last week and then you didn't. What were you going to say?" Miranda looked at her and said the thing. Quietly, completely, without preamble, the whole knowing in 3 sentences, because 3 sentences was all it took. The colleague was still for a moment. "Yes," she said. That's exactly it. How did you know that? Miranda considered this question. I don't know how I know, she said. I just know. Well, why didn't you say something sooner? Miranda almost laughed at that. I did try, she said, but the room wasn't ready. Gate 23 lives in the throat center, the center of manifestation and communication, where knowing becomes language, where the internal becomes expressible. It sits in individual circuitry in the channel of structuring with Gate 43, the gate of insight. And together they carry something Ra described with characteristic precision as the channel from genius to freak. The individual knowing that arrives from the ajna, rationalized and certain, and entirely unexplainable, meeting the throat's capacity to put it out into the world. This is a projector channel, which means, and this is the mechanical truth that changed everything for Miranda, that it needs to be recognized and invited in order to have a chance of landing. Not as a social nicety, not as a suggestion that Miranda tone herself down a bit, but as a precise mechanical fact. The insight that is received correctly in the right moment with the right invitation can shift how an entire room thinks. Not gradually, not by argument or persuasion, but in a pulse, a quantum leap rather than an incremental improvement, the structuring of something previously unstructured, sudden clarity that changes everything that comes after it. The insight that arrives without that, in a room that isn't ready, without the question that opens the door, lands in the silence. The fingernails get examined. The genius is indistinguishable from the freak until the moment itself makes the difference clear. Gate 23 is the gate of eliminating intolerance, which is, when you sit with it, a quietly radical idea. The individual has always attracted friction for carrying something that doesn't fit existing categories. And Gate 23's response is not to make the individual less individual. It is to find the language, the precise, careful, exactly right in the moment language that allows the collective to hear what it needs to hear. If the insight is truly valuable, it has to be able to be communicated, not dumbed down, translated. The genius finding the form in which the world can finally receive it. Miranda is also, it should be noted, constitutionally deaf to input. This is not arrogance. Again, it's mechanics. The genetic protection of an individual knowing that would be contaminated by too much outside influence. She has to arrive at things herself. When she does know, truly and completely, she can listen, because by then her knowing is secure enough not to be thrown off course. She still blurts, occasionally. Fingernails and ceilings still get examined. But she has learned slowly, and with some evidence to support the learning, to feel the difference between the knowing and the moment, to hold the insight a beat longer, to wait for the question that opens the door. Her colleague recommended Miranda for a project 3 weeks later, something she'd been passed over many times before. Miranda didn't say, I know, when she heard. She waited until she was alone, and then she said it. The knowing, as always, had arrived before the confirmation. The world had simply needed a little time to catch up. Thank you for joining me and exploring Miranda with me. And looking at Gate 23 in this way. I hope you're enjoying this series and this new way of looking at the gates of human design. And until next time, always love yourself and always go gently.